She was 22 and homeless, no family left to call, no address to put on a job application, just a duffel bag and $10 folded into the pocket of an old canvas jacket. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned lighthouse standing on a rocky point at the edge of the Atlantic, in a forgotten stretch of the Maine coast. The lens was broken. The lantern room was open to the weather. The town clerk who sold it to her said she'd be lucky if the stairs didn't collapse under her within the year. But what nobody knew was that, at the very top of that lighthouse, sealed inside a compartment that hadn't been opened in almost 60 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Maren Ashworth had been drawn to the sea for as long as she could remember. Even though she grew up almost 200 miles from it, she was born in a small logging town in western Maine, the kind of place where the trees outnumbered the people, and the closest thing to open water was a reservoir behind the middle school. But her grandmother, who raised her, had grown up in a lighthouse family on the coast, and the stories never stopped. Stories about fog signals and shipwrecks, about keepers who logged the weather 3 times a day for 40 years, about a great-great-uncle who had rowed out in a nor'easter to pull for fishermen off a swamp dory. Maren drew lighthouses the way other kids drew horses. By the time she was 10, she had a shoebox full of sketches, towers with different shapes, different light patterns, different colored stripes, all copied from a library book about the lighthouses of New England that she renewed so many times the librarian eventually just let her keep it. Her grandmother died when Maren was 13. A stroke, sudden, no warning. One evening she was reading to Maren on the porch, and 3 days later, she was gone. Maren's mother had left before Maren could form real memories of her, and her father, a quiet man who worked at the sawmill, had never quite recovered from being left. After his mother-in-law died, there was no one left to soften him, and something in him went the way certain things go when nobody is there to hold them up anymore. Not all at once, but slowly, the way a house settles after the people who loved it stopped repairing it. By the time Maren was 17, her father was a man who came home from the mill, ate dinner in silence, and fell asleep in front of the television with the volume too low to actually hear. She would talk to him, and he would nod without really listening, his eyes somewhere past her shoulder, fixed on nothing. She stopped expecting more from him. It hurt less to stop expecting than to keep being disappointed. She got a job at 16 at a small maritime museum an hour away, cataloguing donated photographs and ship's logs for a modest hourly wage that felt like a fortune at the time. The curator, an older man named Elias Cobb, had spent 30 years restoring lighthouse artifacts before he retired into the museum job, and he saw something in Maren that most people missed, not pity, but genuine curiosity. She learned to read a Fresnel lens diagram. She learned the difference between a first-order lens and a fourth-order lens, why some lighthouses flashed and others held a steady beam, what a fog signal building was for, why a keeper's log mattered more than people realized, because a log was a record of a place's whole memory, kept one entry at a time. Elias taught her to splice rope the old way, to read a nautical chart, to identify a lighthouse by the shape and rhythm of its light alone, a skill he called reading a signature. He taught her that a lighthouse is a system, and the system, once you understand it, can always be restored. Understanding how a system works, he told her once, is the most useful thing a person can carry with them, because everything worth keeping, buildings, boats, people, a life, is a system underneath, and the system that's broken isn't gone. It's just waiting for someone who knows how to read it. Maren saved almost everything she earned. She kept the money folded inside an old tobacco tin her grandmother had used for buttons, tucked into the bottom of her school backpack. By the time she was 20, she had $960. Her father died on a Tuesday in early spring, a heart attack at the mill loading dock. He collapsed before the ambulance arrived. Maren was called out of class to identify a name she already knew, The house they'd lived in belonged to the mill, part of a company housing arrangement that ended the moment his paycheck did. The foreman gave her 3 weeks. Not unkindly, he had 2 families waiting for the same 4 walls, and told her that was the best he could manage. Maren nodded. She had already been expecting it in some quiet corner of her mind for years. She packed her father's few things into boxes for the church donation bin, kept his old wool coat and a photograph of her grandmother standing in front of a lighthouse somewhere on Mount Desert Island, and folded the rest of her life into a duffel bag and a backpack. On the morning the eviction took effect, she stood on the porch for a long moment before pulling the door shut behind her. She had nowhere to go and no one waiting, but she had been thinking about the coast for months, ever since Elias had mentioned, almost in passing, that his cousin managed municipal property auctions for a string of small coastal towns, and that abandoned lighthouses came up more often than people assumed, decommissioned by the Coast Guard, deeded to towns that couldn't afford the upkeep, sold off for the cost of back taxes just to get them off the books. She rode a bus to Portland, then a smaller bus north along the coast, watching the land change beside her, the pines thinning, the air turning salt-heavy, granite ledges breaking through the soil like the bones of the earth pushing up to breathe. She had never seen the ocean in person. She had only ever seen it in library books and in her grandmother's stories. When the bus rounded a bend and the water opened up grey and endless to the horizon, she pressed her hand flat against the window glass and didn't say anything at all. She arrived in a small harbour town called Anset Point at dusk. Elias's cousin, a weathered woman named Dot Hollis, who ran the town's tiny property office out of the back room of the hardware store, was waiting for her. Having gotten a call from Elias 2 days earlier, Dot didn't waste time on small talk. She drove Maren out along a narrow coastal road to a rocky point where a lighthouse stood alone against the darkening sky, its white paint gone grey and peeling, one of its lantern room windows broken out entirely. The attached keeper's cottage beside it collapsed almost to its foundation. "That's Widow's Point Light," Dot said. "Decommissioned by the Coast Guard back in the 60s when they automated the channel markers. Town's owned it since. Done nothing with it since. Costs us money to insure a building nobody uses. So the selectmen finally agreed to let it go for back taxes owed. Comes to $10 even. If you can believe it, nobody's wanted it. Structure sound, they tell me. Stone all the way up. But the inside's a different story." Maren walked toward it across the wet grass, the wind coming hard off the water and pulling at her jacket. The tower rose 60 feet above the rocks, round, tapering slightly toward the top. "Built of granite blocks quarried," Dot said, "from an island 8 miles offshore. The mortar had crumbled in places, but the stone itself looked as solid as the ledge it stood on. The iron lantern room at the top had lost most of its glass, and a section of the gallery railing had rusted through and fallen away. But the shape was there, the bones were there. It was a tower built to survive 100 years of Atlantic winters. And even wounded, it looked like it intended to survive 100 more. How much?" Maren asked, though she already knew. $10, Dot said. "You want it, it's yours. But I'll tell you now, the town won't be putting a dime into it. Whatever happens to that lighthouse from here on out happens because of you." Maren took the tobacco tin from her backpack and counted out 10 $1 bills into Dot's hand. Dot looked at the money, looked at Maren, and something in her face softened. "You know anything about masonry repair?" she asked. "Anything about restoring ironwork, glazing a lantern room, keeping a stone tower dry in a coastal winter?" "I know how a Fresnel lens works," Maren said. "I know how to read a keeper's log. I can learn the rest." Dot handed her a heavy iron key. "Sleep on it tonight if you've got somewhere to sleep. We'll talk particulars in the morning." Maren climbed the spiral stairs that evening as the light faded outside, her footsteps echoing up through the hollow stone throat of the tower. The stairs were cast iron, worn smooth in the center of each tread by a century of keeper's boots, and they held her weight without complaint. She counted 89 steps before she reached the watch room, just below the lantern, a small round chamber with a single window facing the sea. The air inside smelled like cold stone, rust, and something faintly sweet, old kerosene, maybe, soaked so deep into the wood of the floor that 60 years hadn't lifted it out. She stood in the middle of that small round room and felt the whole tower sway almost imperceptibly in the wind, the way tall old stone buildings do, a movement too slight to see, but impossible not to feel in your feet. It should have frightened her. Instead it felt like a heartbeat. She slept that first night on the watchroom floor in her coat, using her duffel bag as a pillow, and listened to the sound she would come to know better than any other sound in her life, the long, slow breath of the Atlantic against the rocks below, patient and endless, arriving over and over, and no matter what else in the world was happening. The next morning, Doc came out with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of blueberry muffins from the general store, and they sat on the granite ledge below the tower and talked about what needed to happen. The list was long. The lantern room needed new glass and a rebuilt gallery railing. The mortar joints needed repointing from the ground up. The interior stairs needed rust treatment and new anchor bolts. The keeper's cottage beside the tower was beyond saving, but the tower itself, Dot said, was a different matter entirely. Granite doesn't rot, and if the roof and the lantern room could be sealed against the weather, everything else was simply labor. It's a year's work if you do it properly, Dot said. Maybe longer. You can live in the tower while you go. There's no law against it, but it's going to be cold, and it's going to be hard. I can do hard, Maren said. She started with the lantern room, because an open lantern room meant every storm that came through was pouring water straight down the inside of the tower. She spent her first week clearing broken glass and rusted ironwork, hauling debris down 89 steps, 1 bucket at a time, her shoulders burning by the end of each day, and the way she'd never felt before. A local glazier, a man named Force, who had fitted storm windows on half the houses in Ansett Point, came out after Dot put in a word, and together they measured the lantern room's panes and ordered custom-cut safety glass. And Maren learned to set glazing compound with her bare, cold hands, working carefully around the old iron muntins so as not to crack the century-old ironwork holding them. It was on the 3rd week, while she was clearing out a section of built-in cabinetry in the watchroom below the lantern, that her crowbar caught on something that wasn't wood. She pried back a warped panel that had been fitted flush against the curved stone wall, so cleverly built into the room's paneling that it had looked, at first glance, like nothing more than part of the wall itself. Behind it was a shallow stone recess, no more than 2 feet deep, sealed for decades behind that hidden panel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, was a wooden chest with iron corner brackets, and a keeper's brass nameplate screwed into the lid. She sat back on her heels and stared at it for a long moment. Then she went to find Dot came back with her, climbed all 89 steps slower than Maren had, and stood looking at the chest with her hands on her hips. "That'll be Silas Marrow's," Dot said finally. "Last keeper before the Coast Guard automated the light in '61. Kept this station for 38 years. Man and boy, right up until the day they took the light away from him. Never married, no children that anyone knew of. Died in the county home in Bangor about 15 years back. Nobody left to claim much of anything he had." She shook her head slowly. "Folks always said Silas Marrow has spent a dime he didn't have to. Wondered where all his keepers' pay went all those decades. I suppose we might be looking at the answer." They carried the chest down together, Maren going first, Dot handing it down step by step through the narrow stairwell until they set it on the flat granite ledge outside in the daylight. Dot handed Maren a claw hammer. "It's your tower," she said. "You should be the one." Maren pried the corroded hasp free. The lid, swollen with 60 years of damp sea air, came up slowly, with a groan of old hinges. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and newspaper gone the color of weak tea, were bundles of keepers' logbooks, each one dated by year, and beneath them, packed into a smaller strongbox within the chest, were rolls of coins and folded currency, along with a small canvas pouch, heavier than it looked. She opened the pouch first. Gold coins, not many, but old ones, the kind minted before Maren was even born, the kind Elias had once shown her photographs of in a museum reference book. Beneath the pouch, in the strongbox, were bundles of silver dollars and paper currency going back decades, some bills so old the ink had faded to the color of driftwood. A coin dealer that Dot brought out from the county seat 2 days later spent an entire afternoon going through it all, and when he finally added everything up, the gold, the silver, the currency, accounting for both face value and collector value, the total came to $52 for 100 dots. At the very bottom of the chest, beneath the last bundle of currency, was a keeper's logbook different from the others, bound in leather instead of the plain cloth covers of the rest, with Silas Marrow's name stamped on the front in gold that had mostly worn away. Tucked inside its front cover was a folded letter, the paper soft with age, addressed in a careful, old-fashioned hand, to whoever tends this light next. Maren unfolded it and read, "My name is Silas Marrow. I kept the light at Widow's Point for 38 years, from the spring of 1923 until the winter of 1961, when the Coast Guard came and told me the light no longer needed a man to watch it. I want whoever reads this to know that a lighthouse is not just stone and glass. It is a promise. Every night I lit that lamp, I was telling every sailor out on that black water that someone was watching, that someone would notice if they didn't come home. I never had a wife or children of my own, but I never once felt alone up in that lantern room, because I understood I was keeping a promise to people I would never meet. I saved what I could over the years, because I had no family to spend it on, and because I always believed that someday, somehow, this tower would need tending again, by someone with less than they deserved and more heart than sense. If you are reading this, you found what I left because you were looking hard enough at a place other people had given up on. That tells me something about you already. Take care of her. She has kept her promise a long time. I hope you'll let her keep it a while longer. Silas Marrow, Keeper, Widow's Point Light." Maren read it twice, sitting on the cold granite with the wind pulling strands of hair loose from her braid, and her throat went tight in the particular way that has nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with being seen by someone we'll never get to thank. She thought of her grandmother's stories on the porch, of Elias patiently teaching her to read a lens diagram, of her father staring past her at nothing at all, and she understood, the way you understand something only once and then carry it forever, that some people leave a light burning long after they're gone, in whatever way they can. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever found something unexpected in an old building that made you see the place differently? Helped Maren open an account at the small bank in Ansett Point the following week. The teller, a young man not much older than Maren, went pale looking at the contents of the grocery bag she'd carried it in, and called for the branch manager, an older woman named Corrine, who read Silas Marrow's letter slowly, all the way through, before handing it back with tears standing openly in her eyes. "My father knew Silas," she said he was the loneliest happy man he ever met. "I'm glad his light found somebody worth keeping it." Maren used part of the money to do the restoration properly, and spent the next year of her life doing it. Forster Glazier finished the lantern room glass, and Maren learned to set each pane herself, under his guidance, until the tower's crown was whole again. Unbroken glass catching the morning light for the first time in decades. A mason from 2 towns over, a quiet man named Purdy, who had repointed half the granite foundations on the coast, taught her to mix traditional lime mortar and repoint stone the old way, working from the base of the tower upward, one course at a time. Her hands cracked and raw from the lime by the time the first winter set in. She rebuilt the gallery railing with salvaged iron and new bolts. She rewired the tower with modern cable run carefully through the original conduit channels, so the old stone wouldn't need to be disturbed. And she installed a small solar array on the keeper's storage shed she rebuilt from the collapsed cottage's salvaged granite blocks, wiring it to a battery bank that ran lights, a small heater, and eventually a modest kitchen she built into the tower's ground floor, where the old fuel storage room had been. She restored the lens mechanism itself last. After months of research and letters back and forth with a small maritime preservation society in Rockland, learning to clean and reseat the old brass gears, to true the rotation mechanism, to fit new LED lamps behind glass that had been dark for 60 years, the night she finally switched it on, standing alone at the base of the tower and watching the beam sweep out over Blackwater for the first time since Silas Marrow had climbed those stairs for the last time. She cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since her grandmother died. Standing in the cold with her breath fogging and the light turning steadily above her, a promise being kept again. The town noticed her the way small coastal towns notice anyone who shows up and does hard, honest work without complaint. Dot brought her firewood that first winter without being asked. Corinne at the bank started setting aside interesting local history clippings for her. A lobsterman named Gareth, who had fished the waters off Widow's Point his whole life, started leaving a share of his catch at her dock rail on Sunday mornings, never staying long enough to be thanked properly. An old woman named Beatrice, who had known Silas Marrow as a girl, began stopping by on Thursday afternoons with stories about the way Silas used to wave a lantern at passing fishing boats just to let them know he saw them, about the dog he'd kept 4 years named Compass, buried somewhere on the point that nobody could quite locate anymore. Maren wrote it all down in a notebook she kept beside Silas's old logbooks, on the same shelf where she'd found the letter, building a record of a man she had never met, the way you piece together a life from fragments. A story here, a photograph there, a keeper's logbook filled with 60 years of tide tables and weather notes, and the quiet, faithful discipline of a man keeping his promise one entry at a time. By the time Maren had lived at Widow's Point for 2 years, the Maritime Preservation Society had asked her to help train volunteers, restoring to other decommissioned lighthouses further up the coast. She had learned, in the space of those 2 years, more about masonry, glazing, ironwork, and the particular discipline of maintaining a working lens than most people learn in a lifetime. And it turned out the coast was full of towers just like Silas Marrow's, beautiful, structurally sound, and quietly waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. One evening in late autumn, Maren climbed the 89 steps to the watchroom and sat by the window where she had slept her very first night, watching the sun go down deep orange over water gone the color of hammered pewter. The light above her turned steadily, sweeping its long beam over the water and back, out and back, the same rhythm it had kept for 100 years, interrupted only by the 60 years Silas Marrow's light had waited in the dark for someone to come find it again. She thought about Silas, a man who kept a promise to strangers for 38 years and saved every spare dollar because he had no one to spend it on, and who still, at the very end, believed that someday someone would need what he'd left more than he did. She thought about her grandmother's stories on the porch, about her father who had stopped, ember by ember, after the person who loved him best was gone, about Elias, who had seen something worth teaching in a quiet girl cataloguing old photographs for a few dollars an hour, about Dot, who had handed a homeless 22-year-old the key to a tower nobody else wanted. She understood, watching the beam sweep out over the dark water, that she had been moving toward this light her whole life without knowing its name. She had drawn towers since she was old enough to hold a crayon. She had memorized lens diagrams. She had listened to her grandmother's stories until they became the shape of her own longing. She had been pulled toward something long before she understood what it was, and the pull had never once been wrong, even when everything else in her life had been taken away. That's the thing about the directions our lives are pulled in. We don't always know where we're going. We can't always explain why we want what we want, but the pull is real, and it's old, and if you follow it long enough, it usually leads you somewhere. For some people, that somewhere is a place they were born into. For others, it's a place they have to find and rebuild with their own 2 hands. A houseboat on a bayou, a schoolhouse in the woods, a stone cottage on a hillside, a lighthouse standing alone on a rocky point at the edge of the sea. The form doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can stand inside it, Look around and feel something settle in your chest that says, "This is the place. This is where I begin." Maren Ashworth was 22 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a broken lighthouse on a forgotten point in Maine. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what's a light you've been following your whole life, even before you understood what it was leading you toward? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.